bayonets, comrades. This is the Chief Guard of the Republic radio show with your co-hosts Mike Tooman and Paul Burvid. Every Saturday, noon to 1, WRMN, 1410 AM, Fox River Valley Media Network here in Studio 14. We're streaming on WRMN1410.com. Studio number here is 847-931-1410, or you could text us at 505-926-1410. I see the magic 505 phone right over there for the text. Or you can hit us up in the comments on the Facebook Live channel. All right. So this week, a lot of I noticed in the newspapers and stuff. Again, one of the things I want to make this show about is to clear up a lot of information, and I'm not calling it misinformation, but I think the mainstream media, our legacy press. I love that legacy press. All right. I think they leave a lot out. They twist stuff and they take sound bites and they try to make it look like, oh, it's the end of the world and stuff. And I'd like to straighten a lot of that out with pure information that explains to people. I think when they do these, they should start out with explaining what's happening. So, Paul, tell us a little bit about how anywhere in the world can become a territory of the United States.
Okay, well, the president has to request Congress to allow the acquisition, let's say, of a area, and it has been done in the past. Okay, and there's a couple of different ways of it happening. One by force, like through a military engagement, which is kind of how we got Puerto Rico and at one time, part of the Philippines and stuff like that. Another way would be through purchase, and it's kind of amazing because until I really looked at it, people forget that we actually purchased Florida after Illinois became a state. Florida was purchased in 1819, a year after Illinois was a state in 1818. It could be from annexation like Texas, or again, purchase like Oregon from Great Britain, and also the Gadsden Purchase and the Louisiana Purchase, or it could be done, like I said, through military force. And we've got locations in the Midway Islands. And then there's something real interesting. A lot of our territories came from something called the Guano Act of 1856. They were going to use this bird guano as a resource, and it was on these remote islands. And we got, that's my local congressman calling for a chat. It'll be over in a second, but the Johnson Atolls were part of that. And then there was also the Baker Islands were, Howland Island and Baker Island were part of that. So it just depends on what the need is. Mostly, though, it's done through a purchase, like an acquisition with another country. And there's been significant precedent. Again, we got Louisiana that way. We got Oregon in the Northwest that way, and we got Alaska that way. And then we got Florida, which I think is real interesting. And that Florida came from Spain. So it could be done through purchase, it could be done through necessity like during war, or it could be done through an actual takeover, which is also during the war.
I think when you say purchase, that's actually part of a treaty. So it doesn't have to be purchased. It could also be a treaty, like in the Panama Canal zone. That was done through a treaty. Although payments were made, it wasn't a purchase outright of that canal zone. It was almost like a lease of it, and we entered into a treaty with Panama to have that.
Was a treaty, and so was Guam and Puerto Rico.
I still call Guam Formosa. Wait. I still call. That's right. I call Taiwan Formosa. To me, it'll always be Formosa. But
and then we got the outer islands and the Kingman Reef and Swanis Island, those were by annex. And then it's interesting because most of our territories are in the Pacific, with the exception of with the exception of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and there's one other one that are in the Pacific. Atlantic. Most of the other ones are in the Pacific.
Yeah. So going back, Thomas Jefferson was one of the authors of the Constitution, one of the founding fathers. He basically he was the man that wrote the Declaration of Independence that was approved by the Continental Congress at the time. All right. So he was a very strict adherence to the Constitution. However, in the Constitution, it provided no strict outline powers of whether the president or Congress could actually go and purchase land. All right, so he entered into agreement with Napoleon for the Louisiana Purchase, and he was iffy about it, but it was getting short in time. So it was approved. It was approved, but he wanted a constitutional amendment to make it very specific on how this could happen. Later on, John Marshall came out in not a decision, but he wrote about it, what he would have done at the time, because I don't believe it came up as a constitutional question to the Supreme Court. But he said that yes, there are two ways. The two ways the U.S. could attain more territory. One was through force, all right. So, and the other was through treaty, all right. And in a treaty, the president is the only person in the United States that can enter into a treaty with any foreign power. However, that treaty has to be approved by a 2/3 majority of the Senate, not the House of Representatives, just the Senate. And back then when that was written, senators were not elected by popular vote. They were elected by their state legislatures, which was even more of a republic, all right? So they had the Senate had the oversight to keep a president from going about that stuff. That still holds true today. So the big thing that came out, I think the number one thing, and people don't realize how dangerous this is Greenland, all right? Greenland came up in that possible annexation of turning Greenland into a territory of the United States, and they say the 51st state. But in order to be a state, first you have to be a territory. And it is possible because Greenland is an autonomous state under Denmark. All right. So if the Greenland people voted for independence from Denmark, and we acknowledge that, we recognize them, and other countries recognize them, and then they voted to become a territory of the United States, and we entered into a treaty with them to bring them a territory of the United States, and they did, and that was approved by the Senate, all right, through a treaty, because the president would enter into a treaty with them, Senate would approve it, then they become a territory of the United States, and then they would look forward to possibly being the 51st state. Although there's other territories that are in line for that, but this is a self-determination of the peoples, all right? The peoples. The people. Puerto Rico has had multiple opportunities to vote through the popular vote that if they wanted to be a state, if they wanted to enter into statehood, and again, it goes through the Senate, it goes through Congress. The whole Congress has to approve statehood. Right? And they have not yet voted to obtain statehood for the United States. So it is possible that Greenland could do that. Now, through military force, the question comes up, right? We already have military bases in Greenland. Would we be able to take over Greenland? Well, I think their total population of 56,000, we could do it with the National Guard or the reserves, probably just the Marine Corps. Go in there, and we could outnumber them 2-1. But would we want to do that? Because they're part of Denmark, and Denmark's part of NATO. and entering into a war with NATO would cease NATO to exist, and that would be a great thing for the Russians. So people think that it's hyperbole by President Trump to say that, but a president-elect, former president and current president-elect Trump to say something like that. But what they don't realize is China and the Arctic. There are a lot of unexplored resources in the Arctic, but most of which is fishing industry. And as we know, China needs a lot of food. The other thing is, if for some reason the Panama Canal gets shut down and the Suez Canal gets shut down, then you would have to go all the way around Africa or all the way around South America or up through the passage, the Romance Passage above Russia, which you would have, if you don't have Russia's permission to do that, it's not going to happen. But the Northwest Passage through Canada, that's a different story.
And that is starting to open up with the receding of the glaciers.
Yes, climates change. And I'm not saying climate change, but things happen. And might only be for a couple years. It might only be a freak thing for like 10 years. I don't know how often do the weathermen actually get everything right. But even without that, you have icebreakers. And why would China need 4 icebreakers? They're nowhere near the Arctic. But they have icebreakers, and they're building more icebreakers. The Russians have the most icebreakers. Our fleet of icebreakers is old, decrepit, and belongs to the Coast Guard and hasn't been adequately funded, but we are building some new ones. So there is a big race.
We're also buying some on lease and contract. We bought 4 recently on a contract to increase the fleet.
Yeah, and the reason is we can pass goods through, and goods and commodities and resources through the Northwest Passage, so long as we have the icebreakers to break up any ice that might form and push the ships through. Otherwise, they get trapped in the ice, possibly crushed by the ice, and lost in the Arctic. So, question is, now, if the Chinese are able to set that up, they no longer need to use the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal. They could just go through the Northwest Passage and come down to Europe that way. So, who controls that? Canada. Canada has the most space in there. Canada's Navy, let me see. I took down some notes there. Canada's mighty Navy. Oh, yeah, that's right. 12 frigates. Now, we all know the size of ships, right? Frigate is the smallest ship in the fleet. And of actual, combat ships, seagoing vessels. A frigate, followed by a destroyer escort, followed by a destroyer, followed by a cruiser, followed by a battle cruiser, followed by a battleship. And we're not even talking about aircraft carriers now. So yeah, in fact, the Canadian Navy has exactly 0 aircraft carriers, right? As opposed to the Canadian Coast Guard has 7 Arctic-going ships, 4 of which are classified as icebreakers. All right, so I didn't even get into the Chinese Navy, but it far outnumbers the Canadian Navy. In fact, the Chinese, do they have like 1 aircraft carrier now with 1 coming off the building block?
They bought the one from the Ukraine, which they rehabbed up, and I think they have another one. But some of their aircraft carriers would be considered helicopter carriers, and they're starting to use the vertical takeoff planes off of them.
Yeah, so you can project your force with these. You get into the Arctic there, and now you're projecting your force out there to either sink enemy merchant vessels or control the trade routes. So if you want a ground base, non-Canadian ground base up in the Arctic there, that's Greenland. So Greenland can be the major guard station of ships coming down through the Northwest Passage to hit Europe with trade to make it easier, or to hit Europe with combat forces, or to hit the East Coast.
Greenland is kind of interesting, like you said. They've got a population of a little over 50-some thousand, but most of their population is on the outskirts, and they don't have roads that connect them. There's no way to drive around through Greenland, okay? And there's another possibility too here, with maybe not all of Greenland, but there could be a possibility, as you said, a partition of at least part of Greenland, the uninhabited part of Greenland, where the United States could even take that. And that might be a better sale in Denmark and in Greenland than the full country.
Well, here's what comes. Is Denmark capable of preventing a mass-scale invasion of the populated centers of Greenland?
No.
No, they're not. But they're part of NATO, which makes Greenland part of NATO. So that calls on us in the Article 5, right, of the NATO agreement. That would come on us or the Canadians, and we already said that the Canadian Army and the Canadian Navy, although probably very professional, are not very large, all right? And most of their Navy, a lot of their Navy is going to be in the Pacific, right? So we have it on the Northern Atlantic and the Arctic there. So that falls upon us. They're relying on us. Can Norway hit there? Can Great Britain get that far? We're the closest. We have the most force projection. We have the best Navy. So Denmark is relying on its membership in NATO and us to defend Greenland. All right, and we need to defend Greenland. The other thing, and there we go. With the influence that China has, they've used it in Africa, they've used it in South America. They're setting up right now in Peru. They're setting up, it's due to open up a large port that they had built. That's probably their first success. But they have failed in Brazil to do anything. They have failed massively in Africa. They go into these areas, and through bribery or whatever, they set up an economic zone, a port for trade, and they overextend themselves financially, and they pull out about halfway. They build it like halfway, and they pull out, and they said, well, we built half of it for them. Maybe they could build the other half for themselves, but they don't. It just sits there and rots. They've done this quite a few times. They have taken this risk, and they have lost on it. But if they do the same thing in Greenland and come to an agreement with Denmark, which is a separate country, and Greenland is autonomous under Denmark, that's putting a direct threat to us. And one of the things why we have Puerto Rico now is because of the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe being a compatriot there of Thomas Jefferson, and was one of the persons that negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. So we have the Monroe Doctrine saying that we'll handle stuff in our own hemisphere. Greenland is in our hemisphere. So falling into the Monroe Doctrine and having China come in and interfere in Greenland, that's a bad thing. So how do we have control over it? Well, right now we have, what do you call, we got to use diplomacy.
There's another element to this, though, which is kind of unique. There's a very good YouTube channel on that it's called Q's Greenland. It's a really interesting YouTube channel, and people should watch it because it talks about Greenland in detail. But the majority population of Greenland is Inuit. The same thing as our Eskimos, and the same thing as they call them First Nations people in Canada. So there's a whole other element to this, to like try to unify that, and that could be another point of trying to get control of Greenland for the United States, because they are the same peoples as in our Eskimos and the native people in Canada, so that they are one unified group. So that's a whole other element here that someone should be actually looking at.
But not only in North America, though. The Inuits also spread across tops of Norway, tops Sweden, Finland, and Russia. So
Correct.
There's a lot of Inuit people there also. Yet they traveled the Arctic Circle, which at times is frozen altogether. So there's nothing. If you could walk on the ice, you can move to the next area. Yet so
I got 4 minutes.
4 minutes. Yeah. So now so other than being hyperbole, there's a serious outlook to this. All right. People think, oh, Greenland, but they don't realize how important it is to the Northwest Passage, the trade routes, control of the trade routes, and our competition in trade militarily. I'm saying competition. I'm not saying war. All right.
For markets, competition for markets.
We've been taught in the military for the last couple of years, maybe decade, not to say enemy. All right. You're saying competitors, because we're not actually in a hot shooting war. All right. So there are competitors. So we're competition right now with the Chinese, competition for world influence, competition for trade routes, and competition economically, which is part of the trade. And when we want China to stop doing something or to stop interfering, when we want any country, we try to choke off their money. We put trade sanctions on them, which we say we'll enforce by military if necessary. These trade sanctions, or with other countries. Well, if you're not enforcing our trade sanctions, then we're not going to trade with you either. And we are the largest market on earth, the richest. I mean, the Chinese have the most people, right? Next to India. India has the next people, but we have the most money to purchase the most things. So people are relying on our economy. So in order to get the Chinese to listen to us and to behave in a way that we see is important to our national interest, then we use sanctions, economic sanctions. One of the ways to enforce these economic sanctions are to control the trade routes. And so when we discuss Greenland, which is the north part of the hemisphere here, and we have the one place separating North America from South America, Panama. And when we come back from the break in a couple minutes here, we're going to discuss a little bit about Panama, and we'll be back. Good. So when we left earlier for the commercials, we were talking about Greenland, and Greenland is possibly a territory and then becoming a state of the United States, and how important Greenland was, and how we were countering Chinese influence in the area. So with all the hyperbole up there about that, you have to get out and you have to talk. And when the press brought that up, when I think the key thing is when President-elect Trump brought that out and brought it up, it's now become part of the public. There's a good phrase for it. But the public discourse, the public dialogue, the discourse, and I wish to have the best discourse out there and not have, just screaming, well, he's crazy because it's all this and everything else and whatever. No, there's serious thing, and the discourse is look back in history, look at what's happening, and look at the laws of our wonderful republic, which protect us. Now, I want to talk about Panama, a place where I've actually been. I haven't been to Greenland, been to Iceland, just kind of landed there a couple times, but haven't been to Greenland, but I have been to Panama. I like, Panama's a nice place. I like it. I actually do like the people of Panama. They have a real interesting view on things. The world is one, for them, the world's a big party. They know how to party, but you got to have money to party with sometimes. So January 9th, it was an important day in Panamanian history and in our history too. And it was in 1964. And in the Canal Zone, in 1964 in Panama. This is what led up to the 1999 us pulling out of Panama. We had troops down, we had bases in Panama. In 1999, we pulled out. In 1979, we turned over control of the canal to the Panamanians, but that was directed by the Canal Authority that was still there, that was pulled out in 1999. And again, that was under a treaty. But in January 9th, 1964, the Panamanians call it Martyrs' Day. And they had a student riot in the canal zone where a Panamanian flag had been torn. And this caused a large riot. And the canal zone needed to call in the U.S. military from the bases there. There's Howard, there's Clayton, there's a couple other bases, names right there by the canal, and to put this down. And during that time, we lost 4 soldiers. 4 soldiers were actually killed, 3 by snipers. It was Staff Sergeant Luis Jimenez Cruz was killed by a sniper. Private David Haupt was killed by a sniper. First Sergeant Ronald Albin was killed by a sniper, and then Specialist Michael W. Rowland was killed in a fall into a ravine. So we lost 4 soldiers in 1964. You don't really hear about that, right? It's just 4 guys, little Panama. But research led that this student action was actually agitated by Castro and his people, had come down there with communist agitation against the United States in the canal zone. And because of this big riot and everything, I was around in 1964. I wasn't aware of much. But the crocodile tears, and everyone said, oh, this is terrible, because there was about 21 students that got killed. Right? This is terrible. We need to renegotiate Panama. And when President Carter was running against former President Carter, who's just passed, which is, Martyrs' Day, was that not his, that was the 9th. Martyrs' Day was when they buried him. That was his funeral. And so he was at first against any turning over the Panama Canal. Being a Navy man, a veteran, he realized the importance of the naval fleet and the importance of the Panama Canal. And he believed fully at that time that the U.S. military, the U.S. had to have control of the canal completely for our own national security. But over time, I don't know how he was convinced or anything, that he entered into this treaty with the Panamanians and returned the Panamanian Canal to them, which is, how the canal existed. That was built by the United States, built by investors and pretty much the power of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt pushed it through. But in 1903, we were entering it. Panama was part of Colombia. So it was part of Colombia at the time. And we were trying to enter into a treaty because the Panama Canal had been earlier in the 1800s, they had tried to do this, and they didn't have the power, they didn't have the technology or anything else, and it was a massive failure. But the company doing it still started to continue to exist. And they're trying to enter into a treaty with Colombia to dig this canal and to have it as an American canal zone, a territory of the United States. Like we said, you enter into a treaty. These things are brought by treaty. Well, the Colombians didn't like it. And lo and behold, right after Colombians didn't like it, the Panamanians decided they wanted independence. And they declared themselves as a separate state from Colombia. And of course, we recognized them. And we entered into a treaty with the new state of Panama, and we dug the Panama Canal. And the treaty said that we didn't have all of Panama, just 5 miles from the canal, from the route of the canal, because there are dug canals, and then there are you have to go and you have to dig out the lakes and everything to connect, and the locks and everything. So within 5 miles of that was the canal zone, a territory of the United States. And because it was approved by Congress, the territory, everyone that's born in the canal zone at that time, not anymore, all right, because the canal zone is no longer a territory of the United States, was a citizen of the United States automatically. All right, so you can be born in the canal zone and you could run for president of the United States. So,
John McCain.
yeah, John McCain. He was born in the canal zone. So that made him a citizen, a natural born citizen of the United States. So so that was 1903, and that went all the way on. All right. Now, after 1979, the Panamanians took control. Part of that treaty stated that even though we're turning over canal zone to Panama, we still maintain the right through treaty to use military force to protect that zone because the canal is essential to the national defense of the United States. So up until today, we still have the right to use 100% of our military force to defend that canal from anybody. And that includes people we don't want using it or having it. Back in the 90s, before we totally pulled out, the Japanese, seeing that the Panamanians might not be capable of maintaining the canal, dredging all the lakes that they need to, maintaining the locks. This is very labor intensive. And labor intensive means it costs money, parts, materials, trained labor to come in there, skilled labor to maintain these things, mechanics, engineers, civil engineers, architects, all this people that will maintain this stuff, machinists. And the Panamanians, they didn't think the Panamanians could do that. In fact, the Japanese anticipated that the canal was just going to stop. It was just going to dry up. Not dry up, but get clogged, wouldn't be able to pass through. So they started buying up all the railroads. And that's what we talked about last week, right, with the rails, right, or a couple weeks ago. The rails. So the Japanese said, we're going to buy up all the rail line. And what we'll do is we'll take off our stuff in the port. We'll put it on railhead. We'll put it on the rail. We'll take it to the other ocean, and we'll load it up on another ship. We don't have to pass through the port. We'll just keep two fleets, one in the Atlantic and one in Pacific. Of course, that is tropic area and everything. And they quickly learned that it was really hard to maintain those tracks with the local labor to keep it going. It became a money-losing thing to them. They invested a lot. They started losing money. Currently, the Chinese are doing the same thing. So they're buying up the rail lines to transport their goods. Now, if they get the rail lines built, and if they force their labor in there, right, rather than Panamanian labor, and they maintain this rail line, then it is in their best interest, because they own the rail line, to actually let the Panama Canal fail. That's not in our best interest, though. And what did we say? We will use military force to maintain that. So if it becomes a point where the Panamanians cannot maintain the canal, or intentionally, well, through incompetence or through intentional incompetence, let the locks, the dredging machines, and the whole route of the Panama Canal fail, then we have right by treaty to military enforce that canal, which means bringing our military down there through defense contractors and seizing the canal to keep it open by saying we're dredging in everything. It's kind of like reversing that and not creating a new canal zone, but owning the canal through our military, enforcing it. So we have such oversight on us as the United States, right? Where if we do anything, all the press is screaming about, that's a terrible thing for you to do. But if other countries do it, they're like, well, culture. So the Chinese,
there's a double standard.
There's a major double standard. We always have to be the guys in the white hat. We got to be the good guys. We can't do that. Oh, speaking of which, right? I just want to get this out there. Being an expert into Geneva Conventions, we had a major violation of the Geneva Conventions. I believe it was today or yesterday, probably. And they put the prisoners on video on the news. I guess they took some North Korean prisoners in Ukraine. I'm not going to get off to Ukraine, but that's a major violation of Geneva Conventions. You can't put prisoners' photos up in the press. Simple. It's like, so, and of course the press isn't saying anything about one of their beloved on that one. So yeah, we're under that. So the Chinese can go in and they could bribe, right? They could bribe key people to make sure that they get the best of everything and other people's don't. But if their competitors don't, so they get favorable action compared to us, and that's what's been happening down in Panama, right? Because corruption, I mean, the corruption. We have corruption in the United States, all right? But the corruption overseas, everywhere else but the United States, makes Chicago look like a what?
Like an amateur.
Yeah, not just an amateur corruption. It makes them look like they're a monastery. It makes Chicago look like a monastery. All right, it's like Chicago politics look like monastery politics. Compared to overseas. So the Chinese realize that, right? The Chinese will not suffer one bit of corruption in their own government. They're like, yeah, we know you steal like 10% or whatever, but if you get caught, buddy, if you don't toe the party line, we're going to end you. But overseas, they encourage it. So money's being paid out to certain powers to look certain ways and everything else. And we can't compete on that level because as soon as we do, it's like, oh, you can't do that. That's corrupt. They've been doing it. It's like the outbidding, a bidders war. I think we could always win the bidders war. So I hope people realize that the Panama Canal is extremely important, all right, and that we do have a treaty to defend it. And if we need to reseize the canal zone to maintain that thing going, I think that's a good thing. You got to look ahead. You can't just react to something. If all of a sudden the canal didn't work, stopped like one day, it's going to take us months and everything, maybe years to repair the damage, to go down there, a lot of money and everything. If we look ahead and we stop what's happening now, prevent it from happening, it saves time and money and heartache for everyone else. So if you're not looking at what's actually happening in Panama with the canal, all right, the threats to it, not overt threats like blowing stuff up, all right, but making sure you have incompetent people doing incompetent things to let the canal fail. And then
infiltration through sabotage is what they would do too.
Yeah, but you don't even have to sabotage it. Infiltration through incompetence.
Yeah.
Incompetence.
Right.
Make sure the incompetent people get in.
Right.
We've seen that. We've seen that other places. I don't want to get political again, but we've seen it in the United States. Incompetence leads to destruction. And if you make sure, if you say, going back to World War II, we had a chance, talking about incompetence. I know we're getting on a little tangent here, but talking about incompetence, we had a chance to take out Hitler or Heydrich. Heydrich was they called him the butcher of, what is, I can't remember, but he was a very competent military commander, very competent, all right? But he was also brutal, absolutely brutal. And they made him the military governor of Czechoslovakia.
Butcher of Prague.
What?
Butcher of Prague.
Butcher of Prague, all right? And so we had a chance to take out Heydrich or Hitler, right? And we chose Heydrich because if you took out Hitler, Heydrich would have taken over. And Heydrich was competent, militarily-wise. Hitler was lucky for the first couple years, military-wise. And then his incompetence led to the failure of everything, all right? But Heydrich in there, so you take your choice. You take out Heydrich. So in the world scene, if you want to have a stronger position against a competitor, you make sure that he has incompetent leadership. All right? And so you fund the incompetent guy over the competent guy, and you hope he gets elected in. And in the future, it might look bad for you, because if you destroy the economy of your biggest trade partner, who are you going to trade with now? Well, you hopefully take it over and do trade with yourself. So again, looking back at when you talk about the nautical trade routes, right? China has a very difficult time expanding on the ground. I mean, they could try to take over Korea, not that large. They could cross the Sea of China and try to go into Japan. That might be a little concerning. You know, that Taiwan really isn't that large. You know, Formosa. The island formerly known as Formosa isn't that large. And then you have India, which is highly populated, and they're also the natural resources ain't going to do it. You could try to go into Mongolia or to Russia. That's going to be a big battle. So you want to expand your naval trade routes so you bring in resources to yourself rather than use your own resources on land. The United States has massive resources on land. Russia has massive resources on land. We don't need on our own property, which is self-sufficient. So is Russia. We don't need the trade routes to bring this in, but we need to enforce the trade routes to protect ourselves. China has to have good trade routes, but we have to keep that in our best interest. So Panama Canal, the Northwest Passage, Canada, and Greenland, it all brings it into this public discourse. But to have the knowledge of why that is, as opposed to just screaming that it's ridiculous, it's not going to happen. Well, like you said, we have to look in our best interest. And if our best interest means that we have to enter into a treaty, and in order to keep that treaty going, that has to become a territory, then I think we should do it. But
absolutely,
there is a legal way to do that. The president can enter into a treaty. Yes, he could negotiate a treaty, but that treaty cannot be ratified by anyone except Congress on a 2/3 vote. Period. 5 minutes. All right. So, does anyone out there have a call in about this, or no text in or anything else? Nothing on our Facebook chat. So, Paul, what do you think China? If we close off all if we take care of these problems, what do you think their next move is?
Well, you know, they're building islands that are like aircraft carriers in Asia now, and they're bringing like construction teams out there, and they're trying to build like little islands so that they could put their air assets over there and their naval assets. So they'll just expand. That's why you bring this up. There's an interesting thing going on right now. You know, Canada is trying to get some more submarines, and they're entering into these contracts, and the same thing is happening down in Australia. So there's what's going up in Canada is going in Australia, and the Australians are worried about the expansion of China down there, and they're starting to build up their military too. So what you're saying is exactly true. China is looking for markets all over, South America, Southern Hemisphere, all over. And there's a big thing going on with Africa. They tried to get the market on the cobalt mining, and, they've turned countries in Africa into really slave economic states. And they've got child labor going on there that they don't care about because they're making money for the lithium batteries and all this stuff, and they're just expanding, but they can't expand enough right now, and they need to be contained to where they can't do a forced projection. And but we're working at it on a bunch of different fronts, like what you're saying. We're working at it with Japan, with Australia, with Taiwan, with Canada, with other countries. So they need to be blocked wherever they can be, so that they try to go to another route where they're not firmly established. And I think that's important.
Yeah, and the other thing is like poaching, international fishing, right? So Denmark, right? If the Chinese bring in some fishing trawlers in there, large super container ship fishing trawlers, and do some massive fishing and deplete they don't care. They just don't care. They don't care about wiping out a species, right? And they start depleting that stuff. Is Denmark going to seize that ship from China? No.
They won't be able to.
Are they going to ask us to? Well, I'm sorry, Denmark. We're not enforcing your international fishing waters, which is part of what Greenland is, all right? You go 200 miles out there, they're talking our border goes 20 miles out, but our fishing rights go out 200 miles compared to yours. So the Chinese come in there and they start poaching fishing rights. There's a lot of stuff between Russia and the United States there. Ships are getting seized all the time, and hell, you're in the wrong waters. You're poaching in our waters. The Japanese do it, all right? But the Chinese will do it with impunity. Impunity. You want to talk about wiping out stuff, wiping out whales. They don't care about your international thing about whales. Yeah. We want whale fat, we're going to take it.
They're not concerned about green anything except for green money. And if you've seen, their Coast Guard has even been ramming other Coast Guard ships in the Philippines and all over. They're acting like they're the big brute in the area, the bully.
Yeah. And the reason they put up those islands is the same thing. They're going to claim 200 miles international fishing water from that island. Right. 20 miles out and 200 miles deep. They're going to say, oh, these are our international fishing waters because we got 3 guys on an island.
Right.
All right. So next week, we'll have another fun topic talking about things that are in our national security interests. And if you got questions, call in. If you see this on the channel WRMN 1410's Facebook, make comments and send us questions. Check out our webpage, cgr.silink.net. So cgr.psylink.net, and I have the links. We'll be back next week. I love this show, man. I can see how these guys have it. And Paul, thank you again. The works of Michael Tuman, now featuring the international crime thriller